I don't want no oil, a spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes! Good afternoon, Cleveland, and hello to those of you listening on the internet, wherever and whenever you are. You have tuned in to For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a program where we talk about ecology and the environment, and we talk about them in ways that they affect you, your family, your health, your wealth, your happiness. And we like to do it in a way that brings the issues that are so big, sometimes seem so far away, down home, down to you guys, on a personal and practical level. And speaking of the personal, we have some personal announcements to make at the start of this show. You might have noticed that we didn't start out with our usual Good Morning Toledo. Well, that's because the commercial station that this program normally gets recorded out of, 106.5 FM, has decided to renegotiate our broadcasting contract, and a lot of bureaucratic stuff went along with that we're working on, but we still haven't cleared out, so we were unable to broadcast this past Sunday morning the way we usually do. And that also explains the absence of our beloved co-host, Rebecca Wood. Well, but time marches on, and ecology and environment march on, and there's still all kinds of important stories to talk about. So we're here to talk about them with you, and we're happy to be broadcasting on WGRN. And we also, of course, will continue with our podcast and our YouTube videos. And so you can check either of those out whenever you want. All our past episodes are there. And to get to those, you just go to either your podcast provider or to YouTube and just search for a Green Future. And we'll pop right up there. So on to the news, and unfortunately the news is not that good right now. The big news, of course, environmentally and ecologically speaking, is Trump gutting the Endangered Species Act. If you're someone who pays attention to the environment at all, then you've probably heard about the fact that Trump is gutting the act, which, by the way, is one of the most successful laws and one of the most successful programs in the history of government. It was created back in 1973. That was a time when species were in danger of dying out left and right because we really did not have the understanding of ecological necessity that we do today. Ecological science was just in its infancy, and so the idea that all these things are connected was still very foreign to a lot of people. I remember at that age, I was going to a family reunion, and it was around about 73, around about the time the Endangered Species Act started. And so I was just a kid. I was around 11 or 12 or something like that. We were at a family reunion, and I remember my aunts and uncles talking about this news story that had just come out, that pollution from New York City and the U.S. had actually reached the snows of the Arctic. And they were shocked. They couldn't believe it. They were like, how could stuff that we're doing this far away possibly affect something as far away as the Arctic Ocean and the Arctic ice sheets, because they found this particulate pollution from car exhaust way up very close to the North Pole. And because people at that time were just beginning to get this picture that we're one big connected globe, that we're one big connected ball. And we've talked about that before in terms of the Apollo programs, that those pictures of Earthrise that were taken from the moon as the astronauts were orbiting the moon, that is one of those things that started to put this consciousness into people's minds, that literally everything on the planet is connected and there is no over there. Well, prior to that, in the early, I would say for most of human history up to the early 70s, there were ideas of separation. There was like, this is over here and we can do this over here and maybe we could dump something here, and it's just going to stay over there. It's not going to affect anything else. Well, we have come to realize that everything, literally everything we do affects everything else. Well, I should say we, but of course there are exceptions, and one of those exceptions is the Trump administration. They are trying to turn science, the grasp of the way the world works back to the 1950s and 1940s, because once we had this realization, once it dawned on us, and one of the ways it dawned on us was the fact that bald eagles were endangered. Bald eagles almost went extinct. And I actually saw a bald eagle not long ago in Columbus, just this past week, actually. Not in the city of Columbus, but on the outskirts. So bald eagles have made a recovery, but they were very, very close to simply becoming extinct. And the reason was that we were using a pesticide at the time called DDT. And DDT is a pesticide that can get into the food web, into the food system. And so, you spray it on the insects, and then then it gets into the waterways, and the fish, eat the insects, and then the birds eat the fish. And it's a pesticide that concentrates in the tissues at every one of these steps in the food chain. So the insects, each individual insect doesn't have a lot of DDT in it, just enough to kill it. But then the animals that eat the insects, like the little fish, those have more DDT in them. And if, like eagles, you then eat a lot of fish in order to survive, then you get a lot of DDT in your tissues. And it's an endocrine disruptor. It messes up the hormones. And so eagles were having eggs. They were laying eggs whose shells were too thin. In fact, they weren't a hard shell at all. Some of them were just like a little leathery kind of membrane. It was almost more like a turtle egg than an eagle egg. And the chicks inside those eggs did not survive because they couldn't survive being sat on and incubated. So eagles literally almost went extinct because of this DDT. And the fact that our national bird, that the symbol of the United States, was on the verge of being snuffed out, is part of what led to the creation of the Endangered Species Act in 1973. And I said it was one of the most successful laws, one of the most successful projects that any government has ever created or ever pursued. And that's because since that time, 99% of the species that got listed as endangered have survived. So there's no question that this Endangered Species Act worked. And there's no question that without those endangered species protections, animals like bald eagles would be extinct today. There would be no more bald eagles. We would have kept using DDT. We would have continued to cut down their habitats. We would have continued hunting them. People just love to shoot them because they're so big. And we would now have a world without bald eagles. And apparently that's the rule. That's the kind of world that Trump and the Republicans that are controlling the government also want, because they are threatening to gut the Endangered Species Act. Now, that's headline's been said a lot, but what this specifically means is a couple things. One is that when a species gets in trouble, before it reaches that endangered level, the endangered level means it's literally on the brink of winking out, on the brink of going completely extinct. That's endangered. But before that, the federal government has a level called threatened. And a threatened species is one that is not quite on the precipice of extinction. It's obviously doing badly. It's in decline. There's not a whole lot of them left. And if we don't do something, then they're going to become endangered. So there's, in addition to the endangered listing, there's something called the threatened listing. And threatened species, what we do is we give them all the same protections as an endangered species. So, for example, you can't just go hunt them. You can't destroy their habitat willy-nilly. And that the idea is, if you wait until the species actually becomes endangered, there's so few of the population left that, genetically speaking, you've created a bottleneck, and it becomes uncertain whether or not that species will ever be able to recover, even if you do all the protections. And so rather than wait for something to become endangered, once it becomes threatened, the federal government has given it all the same protections as an endangered species. Well, the Trump administration has gotten rid of that. They have eliminated the idea that a threatened species gets the same protection as an endangered species. And they're just like, well, hurry up and start dying already so you can become an endangered species, and then maybe we'll protect you. So that's one of the terrible ways in which the Trump administration is weakening the Endangered Species Act. The other is fundamentally more dangerous, and that is that when they wrote the Endangered Species Act, they realized some things are more important than money. They've said specifically in the Endangered Species Act, once a species is declared endangered, you can't look at economic impact to decide what to do about protecting them, because of the true idea that protecting diversity, protecting life itself, is more important than money. And so you can't choose not to do something simply because of the economic impact of it. Well, that has been true, and it's spelled out specifically in the law. And Trump and his cohorts, his cronies, his minions, as you might say, have decided to change that. And so now they are adding economic impact to the endangered species clarification, to the endangered species designation. So what that means is if anybody has an economic impact, let's say somebody has an ice cream stand and bald eagles have been swooping down and stealing the ice cream cones from their customers, they could say, hey, that bird is having an economic impact. It's hurting my ice cream business. And they can go ahead and shoot it and kill it and whatever. Same is true of wolves. Same is true of any endangered species. Manatee, the manatee down in Florida, those beautiful, harmless little critters. If somebody could show that the manatees hurt their business, that if it costs them money, they can be wiped out. They can be exterminated. And this is not an exaggeration. The person he put in charge of the Endangered Species Act, her name is Karen Bud Fallon. She has earned her living for a lifetime as a consultant to try for businesses and people that want to get around the Endangered Species Act. She has spent her entire professional career assailing and trying to overturn and eliminate the Endangered Species Act. And so Trump put her in charge of enforcing the Endangered Species Act. So she crafted this gigantic loophole, which this economic benefit loophole that will allow her to approve the extinction of whatever animals she wants. So this is a proposed rule right now. The federal agencies involved with it had a press conference. It was only a half-hour press conference because they were embarrassed. They're like, they didn't want to talk about it. They just announced it, and then they closed up the notebooks and left the room. They wouldn't, because it's indefensible. If you're an American, if you value things like the American eagle or some of the other symbols of our nation, for example, the bison, or even in the South, crocodiles. If you value the wild part of America, and at its heart, our nation has always been a wild nation, a rebellious nation, a free nation, and nothing demonstrates that more, nothing shows that more than the existence of our wildlife, of our wild, our free, our untamed creatures that are roaming our continent. And so they represent freedom. But what Trump wants to do is have everybody in bondage to the economics. They want, because Trump and this gal, Karen Bud Fallon, and all the minions that do Trump's bidding, it looks like they believe that money is more valuable than life itself, that money is the highest value, that it's above, beyond anything else, and that is unacceptable. So that's the big bad news. So I like to toss in a little bit of better news. I had a pleasant experience this past weekend. On Sunday, I got invited up to Monroe, Michigan, and I was invited there by the Alliance to Halt Fermi 3, which is a nuclear plant that they had been planning to build up there next to Fermi 2. And we've talked about the Fermi plants in Michigan before. Just a quick reminder, Fermi 1 was a breeder sodium reactor that had a partial meltdown and very nearly exploded, very, very nearly wiped out both Detroit and Toledo. Then Fermi 2 is a nuclear plant which is running there right now and busily heating up cooling water to pump into Lake Erie to make the algae bloom there even worse. And so they had proposed a Fermi 3, and they'd gone through the permitting process, but it's looking like, the word I got at this rally is that the economics of it are suggesting it will not happen, which is great news, because the thing would be so huge and it would take so much concrete and have such high upfront costs that they're, in these days when wind and solar are producing electricity at incredibly cheap prices. In fact, I just read about a wind power contract, which is a 20-year contract, and the wind turbines will be selling electricity at 2 cents a kilowatt hour, which is unbelievably cheap. I mean, even natural gas is up around 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So in this time of really cheap electric generation, these tremendous projects are simply uneconomical. And the people who have been fighting Fermi 3 are feeling like it's not gonna happen. But of course, word of caution: once a state legislature gets absorbed into the nuclear industry the way Ohio's has, anything can happen. They can put huge additions to people's electric bills to build these plants, and that's happening in some states right now, that literally the utilities have been given a blank check. They have zero risk of their own dollars, but they have the unlimited access to people's electric bills, and they get to raise them as high as they want to try to build the current nuclear plants which are under construction down in the South. And so, not surprisingly, they've gone wild, and that the cost overruns are catastrophic, but they don't care because it doesn't cost them anything. So, cautious optimism that Fermi 3 will not happen. And it was a very nice event. I wasn't the only speaker. Kevin Camps was also there, and he, as you may recall, has been a guest on our show. He's been fighting nuclear forever. There were bands, there was food, and there was also a thunderstorm, which reduced attendance a little bit. But it was a very nice event, and I was very honored that they had me up there in Monroe, Michigan, to speak out against nuclear power. So that was the good thing that happened, the upbeat thing that happened this past week. But something else happened which was not quite so good. As you may know, we've been following for a long time here on For a Green Future Bowling Green's proposed plastic bag ban. It's a law that there's been 9 months of public input and public hearing, and it follows the plastic bag bans in places like California and New York, where the entire state has banned plastic bags. And of course, Europe, where the European Greens and the European Parliament first pushed through a ban on plastic bags. And once that went over very well and people could see, hey, I could live without plastic bags, there's no problem. Then the European Greens went on and pushed for a complete ban on single-use plastic. So no plastic forks, no styrofoam food containers, nothing that's designed to be used once and thrown away. And so now they, since they're so far ahead of us, environmentally speaking, are looking at ways of phasing out plastic altogether. And the urgency of that is becoming clearer and clearer with every day. In fact, a study just came out about a week ago that shows that these bits of plastic, these microplastics that get formed as the big chunks of plastic we create get broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, they don't degrade, they don't go away, they just break into like dust, into tiny microscopic bits of plastic. Well, a study just came out that says that these pieces of microplastic are actually getting caught up in the water cycle. That is, as let's say you're a bit of microplastic and you're floating in the ocean water, let's say the sun's hot on the ocean water and the water starts evaporating. Well, this little bit of microplastic, this little tiny microscopic chunk, will get caught up with the water molecules as the water evaporates and carried up into the clouds. And then once in the clouds, get carried literally all over the globe. Remember, everything's interconnected again. And then it can get dropped anywhere. It can get dropped in Antarctica. It can get dropped on mountaintops. It can get dropped in the North Pole. And so a new study just came out. What they did is they went to the most remote places on the Earth. They went to the glaciers. They went to the ice caps. And they just took the samples of the snow and put it under the microscope. And lo and behold, there were chunks of plastic. They look like, according to the researcher, they're just like multicolored grains of sand. And who knows, those could have been plastic bags that you might have gone to the store 20 years ago and used a plastic bag, and then it got out and blew away and got caught on a tree and blown to pieces, and all those little pieces are now distributed over the entire planet. So the urgency for a plastic bag ban becomes clearer every single day. And it looked like Bowling Green, after only 9 months of public input and something like 6 public hearings and 3 council of the whole meetings where the law was read out, it looked like they were on the verge of actually doing something, of actually banning plastic bags. Well, at the very last minute, one of the city council members moved to table the motion, the law, and I would say that I'm going to just name the parties involved. This was a Democrat who often votes with Republicans, and as soon as he moved, his name's Bruce Jeffers, as soon as he moved to table, the Republicans leapt on it and said, yes, table. And the motion got tabled, which effectively destroys it, which effectively kills it, because Right now, what's happening is the state is considering a ban on plastic bag bans, excuse me. Yes, let me clarify that. The state of Ohio is looking to pass a law that will prevent any municipality from banning plastic bags. And this is happening in some other states in the country. The plastic bag industry, basically, after New York and California banned plastic bags, the plastic bag industry got out their checks and started doing lobbying, and they've been pushing these state ordinances that prevent municipalities from banning plastic bags or single-use plastics all over the country. And so the actual initial push to create Bowling Green's plastic bag ban was to get that ban in place before the state acted, because then Bowling Green and the citizens of Bowling Green would have some standing in a court case challenging the state's right to do this, because the state does not have the right to tell cities, oh, you can't ban plastic bags, because cities have the right to maintain things that affect health and environment within their municipalities, within their political boundaries. And so the state is violating that basic principle, which is in the Ohio Constitution with these laws. But you can't challenge a law unless you have some standing, unless that law is hurting you in some way. And so if Bowling Green, BG, had gotten this law in time, then if the state did try to ban plastic bag bans, it could be challenged. Well, that was the excuse that Bruce Jeffers used for tabling. He said, let's wait and see what the state's going to do. And in fact, what that means is he sided with the state. He was saying, essentially, we're going to wait and let the state decide whether or not we can ban plastic bags before we even try. And so big disappointment for environmentalists in Bowling Green. It was, this was something that the people who were supporting the ban had patiently went through all these hearings and all this public input, and that in the hearings the testimony was 3-1 in favor of banning plastic bags, and in all the informal surveys of random people there was a majority that wanted to ban plastic bags. But of course there's that minority that wants things dirtier, that wants more pollution, and they basically came along and they were being bullies on Facebook, and they were writing letters to the editor, and they were putting pressure on the legislators. And so once again, the noisy, dirty minority derailed something good that the majority wanted. And this is a story that's happening over and over again in American politics. I mean, if you look at other issues like single-payer health care, 75% of Americans want single-payer health care. And yet it's not the law of the land. Why? Because this noisy, dirty minority is using both the power of bullying. They get on there and they call their opponents names, and they don't care about the truth of the matter. They just want to win whatever argument they're in. So that's the attack side. That's the stick. And then the carrot for legislators is lots and lots of money, because most of these people that want more pollution and don't want to change anything so that the earth becomes survivable are people who are getting profit, who are making money off things the way they are. And so there's that double stick. There's the carrot and the stick. And both of them were brought into play in Bowling Green, and a good law that was crafted with the input of the community over a long period of time got derailed. So I'm sorry to have to bear some bad news there, but that's the update on the plastic bag ban. Now, we do have another update, which is slightly more optimistic. As you know, and I have to do a disclaimer here. Actually, I'm going to do a couple disclaimers. We're going to talk a little bit about House Bill 6 now. And the first disclaimer is that I am now employed by a company which is collecting petition signatures to put House Bill 6 as a referendum on the state ballot so that it can be overturned, so that the people of Ohio would have a chance to vote on whether or not they want charges added to their electric bills in order to support nuclear and coal power. So there's my disclaimer. And the second disclaimer is that in order to take that job, I have stepped down, taken a leave of absence from my role as political director of the Ohio Green Party. So now I'm just now I never spoke for the Ohio Green Party on this show. I was always just speaking for myself, as the same is true of all my guests and my co-host. But now I'm no longer, at the moment, not political director for the Ohio Green Party. So anyway, the latest update on House Bill 6, the proponents of a referendum had submitted petition signatures to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General had 2 weeks to look them over and decide if he wanted to accept them or not. And the first petition got rejected by the Secretary of State. They said there were too many technical errors. One of the ways that a referendum petition is designed, first you have to tell people it's a referendum, then you have to summarize the bill that it's a referendum about. And the Attorney General, the Attorney General found a bunch of technical errors where the summary didn't exactly match what the actual bill said, and so it was rejected. So what happened is the proponents went out and gathered another 2,200 signatures in 2 days in Columbus and resubmitted the petition, and now the Attorney General has another 2 weeks to decide whether or not the second petition is acceptable. And hopefully it will be, but it doesn't. That decision isn't going to be due until August 30th. So now it's another wait and see game. So the deadline for turning in the full petition signatures, the whole 270,000 approximately, that deadline doesn't change. So when the Attorney General approves the second petition, then people will have until October 22nd, I believe, to turn in the petitions that would then put it on referendum as a ballot for November 2020. So that's where the fight against House Bill 6 stands right now. It's a waiting game. And so we will keep you updated, as we have been all along, as we have been from the beginning. We're not going to stop following House Bill 6. But after all that heavy stuff, I think maybe it's time for something a little lighter. I think maybe it's time to read the letter from the future. Yes, my great-great-granddaughter, Marie I., is writing a letter from the year 2299. And every morning I wake up, and there is a flash of photons next to my bed. And right there is my letter from my great-great-granddaughter. So somehow she knew that I didn't do this show on Sunday the way I usually do. I'm recording it in my own little studio here. And so she sent me this today. So somehow she knew this. Maybe she had some kind of information from the past. Anyway, here's the letter from Marie I. Dear great-great-grandpa, I'm finally back at my home in the Kola Peninsula. The drilling to inject the nuclear waste of your time deep into the Earth's mantle has hit a snag. As you might remember, this site was chosen for the borehole for many reasons. One of the most important is that there already was a deep borehole here from your time. The Kola Super Deep Borehole went more than 40,000 feet deep. Our drill has been following that path, but the engineers were shocked to discover that the drill bit turned around and was actually starting to come back up. Turns out that the rocks that deep, even though they're not molten, are still slowly making circles into the earth, big convection loops. So now the project is on hold while the engineers figure out what to do. Michael dove into the problem with his usual total focus, and I've hardly seen him since we got back. There was one experience I had on the way back here from Ohio that I wanted to share with you. On the way back, my train went through Germany. and I happened to be there the day of the annual Audubon Memorial Festival, so I stopped to see it. Once a year, people who collect ancient internal combustion engine vehicles from your time are allowed to fuel them up and drive them up and down the Audubon. People lined the road to get an idea of what it was like. Since I'm curious about your time, I went to see it. How could you hear yourselves think? I was amazed that I could hear the motors from almost 5 miles away. Excuse me. And when I got off the train and joined the crowds at the edge of the road, I saw most everyone was wearing ear protection. And you lived with that engine noise constantly? There was every kind of vehicle on the road: trucks, cars, tractors, motorcycles. Of course, we have many of the same kinds of vehicles now, but all our vehicles are silent with electric motors and batteries. It was interesting, but I much prefer my quiet, clean time to yours. Thank you and your audience for making a green future possible. Love, Marie I. So, another letter from my very dependable great-great-granddaughter, Marie I. Sounds like she's having a good time in the future there. And I just want to remind everybody that, we were talking about a lot of very depressing things when it comes to the environment, but it's not all gone yet. We still have a chance to save the planet, to save each other, to save the world. And one of the things you have to do if you're involved in these fights is to get out there and enjoy nature sometimes. Get out there, de-stress, go take a walk in the woods, go to the park, and it's not too late. That's where you can see that things are still alive. There's still hope. We brought the bald eagle back from the brink of extinction, and we've saved 99% of the species that were listed on the Endangered Species Act. When we do the right thing, when we give nature a chance, nature responds, nature rebounds, and nature can heal itself. So I just wanted to toss that note in there before we talk about our final story of the day, which unfortunately is another depressing story, and that is the algae bloom in Lake Erie. The algae bloom is one of the worst that they've had. Right now it's over 620 square miles, and it's not really algae if you know the biology of it. It's something called cyanobacteria, which is a bacteria that can do photosynthesis. They call it algae, but it's really bacteria, and it produces toxins that can kill dogs, that can kill humans. If you drink it, if you get mouthfuls of it, it can cause liver failure. And it's the size of the algae bloom in Lake Erie now is larger than the city of Cleveland. And as we've said, the heat coming off of the Fermi nuclear power plant is making it worse, because what you need to get an algal bloom is hot water, nutrients, and sunlight. And if you have those three things in a wild body of water, and not much motion, still waters. So if you've got those things, calm water, lots of sunlight, lots of nutrients, and lots of warmth, then you're going to get algae blooms. And a study came out done by the Environment and Climate Change Canada, and it said that there's going to cost $270 million over the next 30 years in terms of lost revenue, $110 million of that being lost tourism revenue. And I think that's grossly underestimated because, again, we've talked before about the idea of a positive feedback loop, that when you've got something that's out of balance, something negative, something that puts carbon in the air, one of the effects of that can be more carbon in the air, more negativity, more damage. And one thing that people aren't talking about with this algae bloom, while it's true it does hurt humans if we ingest it or if we touch it, we can get rashes and so forth, but it kills everything in the lake also. So where there's an algae bloom, there's no fish. And the fishing industry in Lake Erie is a $7 billion industry, including the sport fishing and the food industry. If you live along the lake, then you've had Lake Erie perch. Well, if there's no perch because these this algae bloom is happening, you're not, that's going to really, really hurt the local economy. And that's just one aspect of it. It is something that we know the causes of. This is another one of those things. We've done the studies, we know the causes. The farms that are in the upriver from the lake in places like Wood County, which is where I live and actually where I'm broadcasting from today, they are spraying herbicides and fertilizers on their fields. Those are getting into the rivers, into the Maumee River, into other rivers that go into the lake, and that's what's causing the algae blooms. And so the only solution will be to block these fertilizers from getting into the lake. And the easiest way to block them, of course, is not to use them at all, and instead to switch to more natural forms of farming. Instead of pumping tons and tons of nitrogen into the fields every year, they should be putting compost back into the fields. They should be putting organic matter back into the fields that doesn't just run off with the first rain or doesn't filter down into the groundwater. And if we do that, if we cut off the supply of nutrients, we'll stop the algae blooms. I mean, it's not rocket science. Unfortunately, this is another case where political science is hurting the biological science. It's because the farm lobby in Ohio is an extremely powerful lobby. They've been trained to believe that they need to use tons of chemicals to grow plants. And so they fight any kind of restrictions, any kind of regulations. And yet, without those restrictions and without those regulations, the lake will continue to die. And we could soon find ourselves way back where we were before the creation of the Endangered Species Act and before the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency back in the early 70s when Lake Erie was declared biologically dead. I remember that time. I remember going to Lake Erie and seeing just shoals and shoals of dead fish washing up on the shore and clouds of flies that were laying their eggs on them. And it was just incredible that because the levels of pollution we were allowing at that time were fatal to all the sea life, just the same way that this algae is fatal to the life there in the lake. So biological sciences, ecological sciences are pretty simple and beautiful. Most things that are beautiful have a simplicity to them. It's very clear. You put too much nutrient in, you will get your algae blooms. And all this hand-wringing and this, coming up with schemes to somehow ameliorate it, none of them will work as well as putting in regulations that will prevent these chemicals from getting into the water in the first place and using less of them. So that's what we're pushing for. That's why we started this show, was to educate people that there's solutions to all these problems, that this is not just something here to stress you out, that these are actionable items, that we can do things to stop the algae blooms. We don't just have to watch it happen. And so that's why we made this show, and that's why we're here, and that's why we're very grateful that you've been joining us every week since the start of the year. I'm sorry that the people in Toledo weren't able to join us in the broadcast form, but hopefully they'll listen to the podcast and or watch our YouTube video. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, we'd be happy to hear from you. Just send them to joe@joedemare4agreenfuture.org. That's JOEDEMAREFOR greenfuture.org. And you can visit our website, which is also coincidentally joedemare4agreenfuture.org. And again, look for us on YouTube. Look for our podcast. We're also on Facebook. On Facebook, we're just For a Green Future. So this is Joe DeMar. It's been a pleasure, as it always is, talking with you and sharing what I know about the environment and ecology with you. And I hope you guys contact me. Send us some letters, send us some comments, and we'll be back next week. This is Joe DeMar signing off. And this is Joe DeMar signing back on again very briefly because I couldn't leave you guys on such a down note. This is for a green future, and we like to stay upbeat. So just wanted to let you know that Clive Bundy, that insane rancher who got one of his friends killed because they took over a ranger station, he's got this insane notion that federal lands should be free to everybody and he should graze his cattle for get millions of dollars of free grazing for nothing, and he was willing to sacrifice his friends for it. Well, he got laughed out of court again. Yes, now it's kind of funny. Our current Karen Bud Phelan, who I was talking about earlier, the one who's eliminating the Endangered Species Act, she actually used to be his lawyer. But once she got appointed by Trump, he went and got himself a new lawyer and tried to go to court again to say again that he should not have to pay grazing fees because he's him and those are his cows and he should get to graze them wherever he wants for free. And he got laughed out of court again. So that is one bright spot in these dark times, is that the courts over and over again are overturning these insane policies that the administration's putting forward. And there are already challenges in line for the gutting of the Endangered Species Act. So hopefully the courts will prevail and saner heads will prevail, and we will actually continue to protect our endangered species and not sacrifice them to economics. In fact, it turns out that Trump has lost about 90% of his deregulation cases. These cover things like environment, workplace safety, and safety regulations. So much of what Trump is trying to do turns out to be illegal, and the courts have been catching him at it. So there is real hope that this attack on the Endangered Species Act will fail, like so many of his other attacks on environment. Now, there is that 10%. Sometimes Trump does win in court, but we can hope and pray that this time the eagles will win, the wolves will win, the bears will win, and the manatees will win and defeat Donald Trump in court. So it turns out that California is actually one of the most active fighters against Trump in court. And in fact, California has been beating Trump left and right. And the reason turns out to be quite simple, according to an article in the Los Angeles Times. And California Attorney General Xavier Becerra is quoted as saying that when you've got these environmental rules, so much of it is underpinned by the science, and it so often is the case that the Trump administration can't produce the science. So that, I think, sums up the Trump administration in a nutshell. It can't produce the science because what they're asserting is wrong. And so it really comes down to a question of fact versus fantasy. And so often Trump is in the fantasy world, and he's just trying to enforce his fantasies on the rest of the world and on all of us. And the problem is his fantasies suck. He's got this fantasy that says you can put as much pollution in the air as you want, and it's not going to hurt anything or anybody. It's just going to make lots of money. And his fantasy is that carbon dioxide doesn't cause global warming. And I mean, in a way, these fantasies would be good if it were true, but since they're not true, everything he's trying to do sucks. It's based on false premises. It's false. That's fantasy. And so much of what we have today in our society is false. It's based on falsehoods. It's based on things that aren't true. But inevitably, there comes a point where the truth wills out. I mean, you can't intimidate carbon dioxide. You can't bully carbon dioxide. You can't negotiate with carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to do what it wants to do. And so Trump trying to rewrite, what I said once, another law that he was trying to change is that you might as well rewrite the law of gravity while you're at it, because that way we can all have flying cars. And so this is what Trump is trying to do. He's trying to rewrite the Endangered Species Act so that you don't have to protect endangered species anymore, and yet somehow they're going to thrive. I don't think so. I think Trump is, and his accolades, his minions, are trying to impoverish us because we are all richer when the ecosystem is healthy, when there are plants and animals that are diverse and that are beautiful and that are in a part of a functioning ecosystem. That's the whole thing about this. If you're looking at this from an ecological perspective, yes, bald eagles and wolves and manatees are cool. They're beautiful looking. But just isolated by themselves, if just populations separated from everything else, as in a zoo, that is not acceptable. That's not a functioning ecosystem. In a functioning ecosystem, all these cool plants and animals are doing what they're doing, and that they all work together. They all create this interconnected web of life that supports itself and that makes the planet healthier and cleaner and more productive. And without having a healthy enough ecosystem to support these endangered species, you cannot say that you've saved the species. I mean, if the only bald eagles are left are like 20 breeding pairs in zoos, you have failed. The Endangered Species Act has failed. But one of the brilliant things about the Endangered Species Act and the way it's been interpreted and enforced is that the environment that supports an endangered species is protected along with the endangered species because it's essential to preserving that species. So, I mean, we've all heard about there was a big controversy way back in the 80s. One of the first times that the conservatives started challenging this idea was with a dam that was being held up because of the snail darter. And, the snail darter is a rare fish and it needs free-flowing water. And they were going to put this dam on this river, and it got blocked because it would have wiped out the last population of this kind of fish, the snail darter. And the conservatives were all up in arms. They're saying, oh, it's the federal government overreaching. But we now know that there are too many dams anyway. Right now, in the U.S., dams are being removed on a pretty regular basis because for a while there, the Army Corps of Engineers thought every single river in the world should be dammed. And they were putting up dams left and right, and they had excuses about electric power. But it turns out that we don't need all the electricity that a lot of these dams are producing. And we don't need all the flood control. And so what they're doing all over the country is they're removing dams. And fish are able to swim free again. Salmon are able to get all the way up to their spawning grounds. So it turned out that the snail darter kind of heralded the end of that insane period of dam building that went on in the United States. And so what we're getting back to free-flowing rivers that can go over their banks sometimes, but if they go over their banks in flood areas, which we can identify because we have the knowledge to figure out what's a flood area and what's not. And as long as people haven't built houses or put up trailer parks or done developments, retail developments in these flood zones, then it's okay. Rivers are supposed to flood. A wild river is supposed to flood occasionally, and some plants and animals depend on those occasional floods to reproduce and to thrive. Wild rice is an example. Wild rice needs a fluctuating shoreline. If a river or a lake that has wild rice gets channelized or gets put into its banks and never varies, then the wild rice dies out because it needs that kind of natural fluctuation. And on some level, we all need that kind of natural fluctuation. I mean, a river that's just stuck in a cement walls is no longer really a healthy, thriving river. And we're the same way. We need variety. We need things to happen in our lives that are challenging, and we need things that change our parameters sometimes, or we really get bored and it's not good for your mind. And it's one reason getting out into the woods is so healthy, because the woods are different every time you go through them. Everything's growing, some things are dying. You'll see different kinds of animals. So I guess that is a better note for us to end on, that in fact Trump does not always get his way, that there are people standing up to him, and he ultimately is flying in the face of science. So ultimately he's going to lose, because science is based on the truth, and in the end truth overcomes people like Trump and his insane policies, which are based on falsehoods. So I guess that's a more upbeat note to end on. So thank you very much. That's it. Just wanted to end on a slightly optimistic note. Thanks very much for listening. Really appreciate everyone who listens and all the comments that you send in. Have a great week. This is Joe DeMar signing off again. I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun